to start. And Zoom says, took the words right out of my mouth. This meeting is being recorded. So we'll be sharing it on our YouTube in due time. So if you want to rewatch or share it with friends who couldn't make it, you are free to do so. So first of all, I want to welcome everybody to this event that's being co-hosted by the University of Chicago Press's By the Book series and by the Seminary Co-op right here in Chicago. We're going to start off tonight with introductions of Aaron Tugendhaft, our author who's featured for tonight, and our wonderful interlocutor, Bruce Lincoln. Then they're going to chat with each other a little bit about the book, and we'll leave time at the end to answer any questions that y'all might have. Since we have a bigger group tonight, the best way to do this is going to be to pop your questions right in the chat box, and we will call on you, and you can unmute yourself at that time if you want to verbalize your question instead of having me read it. All right, so we also want to encourage you, if you're interested in ordering Aaron's book, to do so through the Seminary Co-op website. I'm going to throw a link to that in the chat right here as well. So you can hop over there, support our local bookstore, and support Aaron with his new book. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two speakers for tonight. First of all, we have Aaron Tugendhaft. He's a scholar of ancient Middle East and teaches humanities at Bard College in Berlin. Before coming to Bard, Aaron was a Harper Fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts at the University of Chicago. He has held postdoctoral fellowships at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, the W.F. Albright Institute for Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. In 2013, he received the Jonas Greenfield Prize for Younger Semitists from the American Oriental Society. He is the author of Bale and the Politics of Poetry and the co-editor of Idle Anxiety. And joining us tonight also is Bruce Lincoln, the Carolyn E. Haskell Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of History of Religions at the University of Chicago. He's also served as visiting professor at the universities of Siena, Uppsala, Copenhagen, and the Collège de France. His recent books include Apples and Oranges, Explorations in, on, and with Comparison, Between History and Myth, Stories of Harold Fairhair and the Founding of the State, Discourse and the Construction of Society, Gods and Demons, Priests and Scholars, and most recently, Old Thiess, a Livonian Werewolf, which published with the press just earlier this year. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Aaron and Bruce. Once again, reminder to please keep yourselves muted during the talk, and we will open it all up to chat later. All right, Aaron, Bruce, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Adrian, and thank you, really, Bruce, for agreeing to do this with me. It's a great honor to have you as an interlocutor with me on this book, really. So Bruce suggested that I open things up a little bit with a couple of words about the book before he poses some questions and we start a conversation. So I have a couple of images to share, and so I'm going to share screen, and just to tell you a little bit about the book and how it came about. So as many of you probably remember, in February 2015, a video was released by the Islamic State showing destruction in the Mosul Museum in the north of Iraq. And I was actually at a lecture about ancient Near Eastern art at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, ISA in New York that evening. And that's when I first heard about this video. And I looked on my phone to see Facebook, and I saw it posted all over, and I watched this video, as I think many other people were watching it as well. And when I saw the video pretty early in looking at it, I thought of this other image. So as you can see in the video, this is just a still, obviously, from the video. There are shown three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king. And it reminded me of this relief, this Assyrian relief from the palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad, in 8th century BC relief, which also shows 3 men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king. I happen to know this image, or it immediately came to mind because this was the image that I had chosen for the cover of my book, or the anthology that I edited with Josh Ellenbogen, Idle Anxiety. But truth be told, that was just the image that we chose for the cover of the book. We didn't talk about this image at all, and I had never actually thought about it all that much until I recognized this uncanny resemblance to images 2,500 years apart, but only 25 kilometers apart, Khorsabad being just 25 kilometers from Mosul. And so really the book for me got started by just trying to think about these 2 images together and what one might learn from them, both in terms of thinking about iconoclasm, the destruction of images, but as we see here, right, not simply the destruction of images, but the making of images of image destruction. And it was that relationship, that the destruction of images and the making of images of destruction, that got me started on this book project. And particularly also, I wanted to think about it in political terms, in terms of the question of what are the politics of images, and what's the politics of image destruction, and what's the politics of images of image destruction, right? So that was the main impetus for the book. The other was more personal. My family, on my mother's side, comes from Iraq. My grandfather was born and raised in Baghdad, and for generations immemorial, my family on that side were part of the Jewish community of Iraq, of Baghdad. And so there's a personal element also in this work, in that the history of Iraq has been, in a sense, over the last 100 years or so, slightly less, the progressive, well, at least this is how I came to it, thinking about how my family, my Jewish family, is no longer in Iraq, and then the stories that were going on, that we were hearing in 2015 about what was going on with minority communities fleeing the Islamic State, and also the homogenization of certain neighborhoods that between Shia and Sunni that was going on in Iraq as a result of the American invasion. And so part of the other sort of impetus for me for this story, for this book, was to think about political plurality, and how one can maintain political plurality, and this kind of push towards a kind of homogeneity that tries to destroy political plurality. And so I was interested in thinking about what the role these images and iconoclasm play in this other issue, which is how to maintain a pluralistic politics. And I think I can add to this, right, that on the one hand, at the time, certainly I was thinking about it in terms of Iraq and in terms of my own history with Iraq, but also I think this is particularly relevant for our experience, right, my other national identity as an American, and the situation more generally of the challenge of maintaining pluralistic politics or pluralistic democracy, which is something that I think we're well aware of today. And so the book for me has also been an opportunity to reflect on that. And then lastly, because I first saw the video on Facebook, this got me thinking about how all of these issues also tie into issues of social media. So not only the circulation of political images, but how political images circulating on social media with our new digital technologies, how that has both continued certain dynamics, but also perhaps change dynamics in certain ways. And so that's one of the issues that I deal with towards the end of the book. And so just finally to give you a sense of why am I not able to, oh, there we go. So just to give you a sense of the book, there are 3 chapters of the book. It's a short book. 3 chapters. The first chapter is called Idols, and it really starts with what the Islamic State in the video says that they're doing, which is that they say that they are destroying idols. And so I explore what that might mean in that first chapter. The second chapter sort of opens things up a little bit to the museums, because the video is taking place in a museum, and I think about the significance of that, and I tell the story of the history of ancient Near Eastern objects since their rediscovery in the mid-19th century, and the multiple meanings that the same images can have, right? So that's really a chapter about how images don't have single meanings, but rather the multiplicity of meanings, specifically political ones. And then finally, the third chapter, called Videos, thinks about how these images get distributed on the internet. And so I have here an example of a video as seen on my Facebook wall. And so I think I'll leave it there and turn things over to Bruce. Unfortunately, I can't seem to, see my, something is strange, sorry.
Aaron, do you want to unshare your screen?
Yes, can you do that for me?
Yes.
Thank you.
There we go.
Wait, okay, now I'm, all right, all good. Somehow I lost my mouse. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, Aaron, not just for your remarks now, but for a wonderful book. It's an exciting read. The issues you raise are big, important. The examples you choose are powerful and dramatic. And it's just, smart and provocative in hundreds of different ways. I really enjoyed reading it. I also think, as I told you the other day, there's just nothing better than a really smart, short book. And this matches that description. I read it at a single sitting and couldn't put it down. I recommend it highly. By way of starting the discussion, there are a couple points I wanted to raise and see what you think. You start with a couple of epigraphs, one from Muhyi al-Din ibn Arabi and one from John Quincy Adams. And so I want to focus on the Adams in particular, because I think I understand that one better. And you quote him as saying, "Democracy has no monuments. Its very essence is iconoclastic." And I guess I want to ask you to talk more about the politics of idols and images and iconoclasm in general. What is it about democracy, that is inherently iconoclastic? You argue consistently through the book that images are inevitable, and any attempt to destroy images is political. Well, images are political. The attempt to destroy images is political, and the political attempt to destroy images produces new images that are themselves political and open to contestation and destruction. And if following Adams, is something essentially inescapably democratic about iconoclasm, why is it you and others seem to find the action of ISIS in destroying these idols disturbing rather than liberating, refreshing, democratic, as Adams would have it? I guess I also want to probe with you, to my reading, you elide the distinctions between image, icon, idol. Those are all terms that you employ. I would add fetish and artwork as other relevant implicit ways of describing similar things. Are these all the same? Is smashing an artwork an act of iconoclasm? Is tearing up any image an act of iconoclasm? Or are there some distinctions among those? I guess along those lines, I want to ask you, how do you feel about, and why do you not include discussion of the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein during the Iraq War? Much publicized and reproduced in thousands of images circulated by those who helped bring that statue down. How do you feel about the toppling of statues of Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis? Are these objectionable in the same way that the ISIS iconoclasm is objectionable? Or are those democratic, liberatory moments? Does the content of the image and the nature of its makers, supporters, and enthusiasts matter in the way one looks at an image at an instance of iconoclasm? Or is it simply the act itself that is open to analytic scrutiny? Let me start with those questions, and we can see where we go.
So thank you for those are a lot of questions there. So
I think we have enough to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but what I'd love, feel free to butt in and interact, because I think that to try and answer all of those questions would just be for me to speak for way too long. So let's try and discuss. So where to start? So, well, maybe the easiest thing I think is to say that I put that John Quincy Adams quote at the beginning of the book, but that doesn't mean that I agree with the quote, which I think but just to be clear, right? I think that you were alluding to this, right? So I actually think that I think he's wrong. I mean, and the whole point of the book is to sort of suggest that it's not simply that he's wrong, but more importantly, I think, and this would be the key, that it is it's not a beneficial or productive way to be thinking about politics. And I think that's, for me, this is really the issue, that I think we very often have a tendency to try to think in these terms these iconoclastic terms, that we want to get rid of everything that is false in order to live only in what is true or just. And this is really a theme that I explore in depth in my reading of the story of Ibrahim smashing the idols in the first chapter of the book. And as I at least in the terms that I use, right, and I think that we could probably argue about whether the terminology is appropriate or not, but just to use the terminology that I chose to employ here was to suggest that this impulse is actually anti-political, in the sense that it tries to escape politics. If politics is understood as fundamentally about the compromises necessary for pluralistic, for different human beings to live together. And that's really, I think, at the heart of what I've been trying to think about, which is how can human difference be managed in such a way that people can live together in a flourishing and productive way that doesn't require eradicating that difference. And I think that that's what politics at its best tries to do. And so with that in mind, when I'm talking about images, I talk, as you say, about how images are necessary for politics in that they give some kind of shared identity to people who are otherwise would be too different, and therefore they do allow for a political community to cohere around certain ideals that's necessary. But at the same time, all images, I want to argue, are necessarily false, or all images are false in the sense that they always leave something out, that there's always something hidden, because an image is always choosing to only give a partial view. And so in that sense, and this is where I
accept the notion that all images, rather than being false, are of necessity at best partial truths.
Yes, right. And but if we're and maybe that would be something to explore. In a sense, I bring those two together partly because I think that that's what the story of Ibrahim does also in that I discussed in chapter 1. I mean, the text of the Quran actually, interestingly, elides the words that we would translate as image and idol and uses them interchangeably. And so I think there's some philological basis for that. But I think that the idea behind the philology, right, is that all images, right, are necessarily only showing part of the story. They're always hiding something, and therefore they're not giving you the full truth, that the full truth can't be presented as an image, and therefore there's always some element of legitimate alternative. Now, that doesn't mean that all images are equal. Ultimately, I want to be very clear that really, I suppose, what I've been wanting to think about is, or what I'm pushing for is a recentering of the necessity for judgment, right? Judgment as a necessary political value, right? That we need to make these judgments rather than come up with some type of theory that's going to give us access to a proper truth and then eradicate everything that doesn't meet that standard, right? Rather, that politics is the constant engagement in judgments and judgments that are never fully satisfying. And I suppose that's really, and here I'm kind of talking around the question, but really that's at the heart of it. What I'm trying to think about is what is it that allows us to live with that non-fully satisfying, those non-fully satisfying images, but yet nevertheless necessary images? How can we live with them better rather than give into the impulse of trying to shatter everything that might have some element of falsehood in the name of replacing it with some kind of truth, which I think is not actually available to us as political beings, right? And I think that's and so that's what I mean by hoping to try and escape politics rather than engage in it. So where to go from there?
Let me
So
just
on the yeah. So
does it make sense to think there's a categorical distinction, and that idols are those images judged to be most false and most heinously false, in contrast to the relative falsehood or partial falsehood of other lesser images?
So one way of dealing with this, and I think that this is a good question, right? These terms, image, icon, idol, how might we use them in a profitable way? So one way to approach it, and this is the way that I develop in the book, making use of how I understand Al-Farabi, the medieval Islamic philosopher's work, that for any political society or for any law, right, a political society with a law, to use Farabi's terms, images are necessary in order to ground that law, or to put it in his terms, to make people care about the law, right? That the law itself is not in itself something that a political community, members of a political community are going to care for, but it's rather the images that make people care for the law, and therefore images are absolutely necessary for a political community, right? That's just to give a little bit more of a gloss on why I say that. Now, idol, from this perspective, can be understood as an image that has been determined by a particular political community, right, to be somehow inappropriate or wrong. Okay? And so this would be one way to say that there's nothing essential about an image that makes it in its very nature an idol, right? But rather an idol is an image, a subcategory of image that has been deemed by a political community to be inappropriate for that political community for whatever reason that political community might deem it such, right?
And that community charges another community with overvaluing.
Perhaps, I mean, yes, but, or I would have to think about that more as to whether it's absolutely essential that one even include another political community. Maybe we can think about that. But for whatever reason, the image is deemed to be inappropriate. What's key here, though, is that if the determination of idol is a legal determination, again here following al-Farabi, right? This is so. If it's a legal determination, then it is a determination that itself depends on other images, right? Because if the law can only exist or can only have force, if there are images that make a community care about the law, right? Then any image that's deemed to be an idol itself in a way is dependent on other images that are not considered to be idols. And so even the most, and this is going back to the John Quincy Adams point, even the most, a community that is the most explicitly iconoclastic, right? In its rhetoric, constantly is saying that it does not use images, right? The way that John Quincy Adams says, if that political community is going to have any force and there's going to be any caring for the law, then according to al-Farabi, there are going to be other images, even if they're completely hidden, right? That are at work. And in a way, one kind of image that I use, and this gets us back to the images of image destruction, is I showed that very briefly, the image of Ibrahim smashing the idols. Well, the very image that we are a community of iconoclasts is an image that around which a political community can gravitate, right? And so I trying to sort of turn that around and sort of see how that image of iconoclasm is itself a political image.
Well, let me give you an example that I worked on some years ago that comes out of the Spanish Civil War. You know, this is an event that took place during the siege of Toledo, early in the Civil War, when the Republican forces had driven the nationalists, the fascists, back into the fortress, but didn't have artillery to break the fortress down, and it developed into a siege that was ultimately failed. And trying to lure the nationalists out into a battle that they would lose, the Republicans hit on the strategy that they picked up wooden statues of Christ and the Madonna, which they waved in front of the walls and said, we're going to burn these. You know, if you believe in anything that you say you believe in, you better come out and protect them because they're going up in smoke any minute. And if you threaten to do that to an image of Marx or Lenin, we would come out and fight. Mm-hmm. And it didn't work. They burned the images. Nobody came out to fight. The siege was relieved and the episode ends. But it seems to me that what's at issue here is an acknowledgement we all have images. We value ours, you value yours. It's a different model of politics than yours, which seems to me predicated on a liberal notion that compromise and community and learning to live together is what politics is all about. And this is a model closer to Carl Schmitt's model that politics is the business of friends and enemies. And you better know which is which. And the images your enemies hold dear that give them courage and inspiration and embody their values are idols you want to smash.
Yeah.
Not just because you disagree with their opinions, but because you want to prove that you're more powerful than they are and you have the courage to defend what's dear to you, and they lack that kind of courage. And if you can do that game, set, and match, you have won the political struggle. Now, it seems to me that's a very different model of iconoclasm and of imagery, political imagery, than the one you're arguing for. But it's one consistent with what ISIS was doing. They're attempting to say, these are false images that people we hate have fetishized. And we will prove the superiority of our values against those of our enemies. And we will prove the cowardice of our enemies by their inability and unwillingness to defend what they claim to hold sacred.
I think that's very well said. I mean, I think that's right, and I think that all I can do, or all I would want to do, right, is in a way own up to the liberal accusation, right, or in the sense. But I'm perfectly happy. I mean, honestly, right now, I'm perfectly happy to be owning up to that. I think that that's really, in a way, like I said at the beginning, the book began in a way with this recognition of the fragility of pluralistic political communities, both in terms of the history of Iraq, right, and very much in terms of our own experience as Americans today, right? And so the real question, right, is if we were to adopt that what you called Schmittian approach, right, well, maybe this is really a question. I mean, if we want to think about this in terms of nations, at least for some level of clarity, right? If that approach were to be taken, it's one thing for that approach to be thought of as how international politics works, and I'm not sure if it needs to be that stark, but we can understand it that way, right? That.
Well, I think Schmitt meant it in terms of internal politics also.
Right. So that, and then, right. And so that would be a question, right? And then I'm happily willing to be labeled here a liberal in the sense that because I don't think that anyone has a monopoly on the truth, that we are better off trying to figure out ways to manage our differences internally, and rather than eradicate everyone who disagrees with us. And I mean, so absolutely, this is a zeitgeist kind of book in the sense that things have become so polarized, and that so much of our discourse seems to be framed in terms of a kind of Manichaean division between good and bad. And I'm trying to recover a certain conception of politics that doesn't work that way, right? That doesn't require that either you're on one side or the other, right? So as I talk about in the introduction, ISIS, so there were a lot of articles about how ISIS wants to eradicate the gray zone, that space in between. And so to polarize the entire world into, believers and heretics, so that there's a kind of clarity of whether either you're on one side or the other. And so I don't think that that's at all limited to ISIS. I think that we see that kind of move going on all over the place. And partly with respect to the social media discussion, I mean, actually, I'm interested in how algorithms actually play into that type of polarization, right? And so the thought is, well, what would it look like to try and precisely cultivate the gray zone, precisely cultivate that space where we might have some level of I hesitate to say modesty and humility in our politics, but I guess, and so at the risk of seeming incredibly naive, I would say that yes, I think
simply that, tolerance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me change a bit. What you've just said is really, beautifully articulated and very attractive. And so I want to change tack a little bit. It seems to me that most of the outrage at the destruction wrought by ISIS in the museums was not predicated on the notion that these were sacred images, that these were icons or idols of transcendent religious value, but rather that they were artworks and masterpieces of civilization, culture. And your chapter on museums, I think, is awfully intriguing along those lines. An Italian colleague of mine, Pier Giorgio Salinas, a wonderful anthropologist, once observed to me that at a certain point, he had tried to locate the sacred in modern society, and particularly in a post-religious modern society. And the test he applied was, what are the spaces where you feel obliged to drop your voice upon entering? And he said he could come up with two. One was museums, and the other was banks. And that he thought that was the closest approximation that contemporary society had to the acknowledgement of being in the presence of something of transcendent power. Could you talk a bit about the placement of these images in museums?
Yeah.
And the way in which international respect for art and culture resonated to produce outrage and horror at the acts of iconoclasm that were directed, not we want to destroy art, but we want to destroy something else that we object to on entirely different grounds.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I agree, obviously, that I think is much more of what was at stake, at least from a certain angle, and what was going on, and certainly in the outrage. And that's something as you mentioned, I develop somewhat extensively in the second chapter. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind right now, which is to link this in a way to what I was just talking about a second ago, right, is to say how if I'm trying to advocate some type of vision of what we might call, and what I said I was willing to accept calling a liberal position, right? I think that one, at the same time that one does that, one has to be careful about what that really means and how that can slip into things that aren't what I'm talking about. And I think that the example of the reaction to the destruction of these objects revealed something, right? Which is that I was talking about this kind of tendency to divide things into a kind of Manichaean opposition, right? And that kind of opposition, well, yes, there is the faithful versus the heretic is one way of doing that. But I would say that the division between civilization and barbarism is also one of these convenient Manichaean moves that short circuits the kind of politics that I'm talking about. And I think that was precisely the move that we saw in the reaction to the video, right? That suddenly it was very clear that there was civilization that had to be protected, and that there was a certain and then there was barbarism, rather than thinking in a more complicated, complex manner. I mean, on this point, maybe I can just share one more image. I'm going to share the screen, and hopefully I won't lose my mouse again. So here you have on the top right, again, the same image from the Islamic State video. On the bottom, here I can play it, make it look nicer. On the bottom, this is an image from the Illustrated London News of the Nineveh room in the British Museum. So the room where these initial Assyrian objects that were excavated in the 19th century were then brought to London and installed. And this image was published in the Illustrated London News, showing people walking around, looking at these objects almost certainly, Bruce, as you said, quietly, right? And so, what?
Reverently.
Reverently, yeah. And so I want to say that, so right here we have two different images about how to comport oneself in a museum. And one teaches that one should be a certain kind of comportment, right? With certain values attached to that comportment and certain good reasons for comporting oneself in that way. And I can say the exact same thing about the other image, right? That, well, are these images of, and one of the things, this is sort of towards the end of the book, I come to explicitly talk about this, but it's something that I try to be doing throughout the book. It's by putting images like these next to each other, that I think that they can start to reveal the elements that are hidden, right? So what I was saying before about how all images are partial, they're only showing part of the story, they're always hiding something, right? And I think that by putting these images next to each other, you start to see how, well, the bottom image, which looks really lovely, and that's certainly how I normally go to a museum, right? But it also hides certain aspects of British imperialism and certain assumptions about history and about civilization, et cetera, right? And the same can be said about the top image, right? That it both reveals and hides certain things if one thinks of it as an image of what one should do, right? We should be opposed to the imperialist powers that have put these objects in a museum and have made us, and that are used as images of oppression, right? Put that way, that sounds good. Like I'm on board with that top image, put in those terms. But then I think that that's also
the British Museum.
What?
So would you smash the British Museum? Take sledgehammers to it all?
No. So what I'm trying to argue is that rather than smash, what we can start to do is we can start to think, and we can use these images to start seeing things in the more complicated way. Now, where one goes with that from there, honestly, and that's beyond what I think I even try to accomplish, other than for what I said before, is like it'll allow us to make judgments as opposed to just smashing.
You use the
image.
image.
Might be wanting to open up to questions in just a second.
Okay, and Adrian, if you can I can't get out, so if you can get me out of the share screen.
I will take you out.
Thank you.
Yeah, whenever, actually, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read this. I think this question is relevant, and then whenever y'all are ready, go ahead with it.
Shall we open it up?
What's that, Bruce?
Shall we open it up?
Let's go. Well, we have one in here already that I think it might be a good time to look at. A question, or it's a two-part question from Helen McDonald. Doesn't an idol have to be something that is worshipped rather than just any image? Or at least should the idol be an image of something that is worshipped? So this kind of question of the sacred, I think, that y'all were just addressing is coming into play in Helen's question. Yeah, so I'm going to try and see if I can at least point in the direction that I tried to take in the book, but really this is in a certain way, this is the question that I try to deal with in the whole first chapter. So in a way, I want to point to that, which is trying to provide a political reading of the Quranic story of Ibrahim smashing the idols, and showing how using medieval texts that are commenting on that Quranic story, showing how it itself was understood in political terms, that the images that Ibrahim is smashing are not, whether or not they're gods in some form that we might think of in terms of the transcendent, or here maybe I'll let Bruce weigh in here on what the modern conception of religion is, but the story, and so this is the way the story in the Quran is very clear, or in the elaborations, post-Quranic elaborations, very clear that these images that Ibrahim is smashing are the images of Nimrod, of the king, and that the smashing of the images is not simply the smashing of some type of divine image that is
falsely worshipped, but rather that that false worship is embedded within a politics, within a political system. And I think so at least that's within the terminology that I'm adopting in this book, that's the way that I would answer this question. Now, I make no claim that I'm giving the one and only legitimate definition of the word idol. I've spent far too much of my adult academic life with the term idol to be so foolish as to say that there is one and only one accurate definition. The best I can do is try and show how I'm using that term and what I'm trying to expose with that term in the work that I'm doing, and let other people who might want to be focusing on other aspects use the term in their own way. But I don't know, Bruce, do you want to jump in on that?
My sense is that idol is a polemic term, and that it's used by those who wish to characterize the sacred images revered by their enemies as false, delusionary, and something to be swept aside. And no one speaks of their own sacred images as idolatrous. That it's always used in reference to another with whom one enters into conflictual relations.
Other questions or?
Yeah, feel free to drop things in the chat, or if you can't figure out the chat, I'll unmute you. Keith, do you have a question? Is that the?
Yes, that's a question. Thank you. Well, and of course, thanks to you both for the conversation. I wanted to pick up basically where you ended in the conversation with what you said about the British Museum and needing to think about what's hidden and the cultural imperialism and whatnot. Because of course we do have a vocabulary to think about all that stuff, right? Post-colonial theory, right? So, which it would be quite different probably than the liberal gray zone that you pled guilty to inhabiting, or maybe not, which is my question. So I kind of wanted to ask, where you see what you're doing as either separate from or overlapping with some type of post-colonial deconstruction of that sort of cultural imperialism that is, behind the image or to the side of the image or not shown.
Taking a second to think. So I want to answer, briefly, I think, which is that I think that work can be useful, again, like any work that is the work of thinking that reveals the limitations of images and what a certain image hides, I think is valuable, because and so I think that that's a real strength. I think that one just, I guess, to put it into the terms that I've been sort of advocating for, right, is to, as long as that one doesn't then move from there to some type of clear binary between false ideology. So one word I avoid in in my book, right, is ideology, partly because it can be used in so many different ways. But I'm trying to avoid any sense of it being possible to arrive at some type of clear demarcation between false and true, because actually I think that then returns us to what a version, I think, of what Bruce just talked about the tendency to call other people's images idols and never one's own, right? Well, if a certain discourse, whether dealing with images or not, right, if whether a certain discourse sort of puts you in that type of position that everything that you're opposed to is false and everything that you hold dear is true, well, then you're just repeating that gesture, it seems to me.
Great. We are about at 7 o'clock, so I want to make sure folks can get out and get on with their nights as they choose. I'm gonna reshare the seminary co-op link in the chat if anyone wants to check out and purchase this lovely book here.
Run and buy it.
What's that?
It's a terrific book. Run and buy it.
Do it. I want to thank Bruce and Aaron and everyone for coming out. I'm going to stop the recording, but if you want to hang out for a second and say your hellos and all that, just like the end of a regular event, feel free to do so. And we'll post the recording in probably a week or so on our YouTube.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Adrian.
And thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Adrian.